Okay, so I did set for record. Okay, so Buddhism. Who's the God in Buddhism? Can you write that in the chat for me? Who's the God in Buddhism? Who's the God? Is it a trick question? Okay, Jasmine got it. There is no God in Buddhism, right? At least not one central God. It doesn't mean that they kind of disregard all the Hindu gods, but there's no real central God in Buddhism. Really, it's based on the following and the teaching of Siddhartha Gautama, who was known as the Buddha, right? So he was born in Nepal, so what we consider to be Nepal today, and he died around 400. Right? So he started off as a prince. So a lot of times when we see images of him, we'll kind of see him in two forms. We'll either see him in just beautiful jewels and costumes. Sometimes we also see him as a poor monk. And the one that we have here actually shows him as the monk, right? Because you notice that his costume is not overly ornate, but you can see that once upon a time he was a prince, and the telltale sign is his ears. Can you see what happened when he took out his gauges? Okay, he didn't have gauges, he had earrings in, right? Anyone ever seen what happens when people take those gauges out of their ears? Their ears get all droopy and exaggerated. So he is shown with these long earlobes that have holes in them that were from all the jewelry he used to wear when he was a prince. And so when he was a prince, his life really surrounded that, living in the palace. And when he was kind of rebellious, and he would break out of the palace walls. And he had 4 different trips that he went on, and he observed a whole old man, a sick man, a dead man, and a holy man. And so when he was observing these people, he was committing himself to trying to find the answers to overcoming suffering. And that's one of those key components of Hinduism and Buddhism, is that we're trying to get out of samsara. We're trying to get out of the pain and the agony of life. And when I say getting out of it, it's not like they're trying to end life. They're trying to have like everlasting life. They're trying to break this cycle of ignorance. And so at 29, he basically left the palace. He forgoes all of his princely duties. He gives away all of his wealth, and he becomes an ascetic. So he basically becomes a monk and devotes his life to religious practice. So he no longer is a wealthy, rich man. So when he arrives in this small village of Bodhgata, he goes into this kind of foresty area, and he meditates until he can completely understand the nature of the world. And so he uses meditation, and that's a key component to the faith, is that you meditate in seeking, understanding of your life, understanding of the meaning of life, and trying to end that cycle of samsara, which is, birth, disease, decay, and death. And he has this realization that's called the enlightenment. And the enlightenment is based on 4 noble truths. So we'll talk about those 4 noble truths. And they're referred to as the Dharma, or the law. Right? So here's some scenes. These are actually in the Smithsonian. These are some really good examples of how images of Buddha's life are often portrayed. At the very top, we have his birth. His mother's name is Maya, and so we have her with hieratic scale, really tall in the middle. And then here we have Buddha in the forest, where he reaches enlightenment. And so he's seen there with his followers, and he's, in a calm sort of lotus position there. And then we already talked about most of these. I'm sorry, this is kind of out of order for some reason. I didn't notice it before. But, you know, the key components we already talked about with Hinduism, so they're very similar. Through meditation, right, and your education, your religious education, hopefully you can relieve yourself of that samsara and reach enlightenment. Right? So our Four Noble Truths. Does anyone know our Four Noble Truths? Anyone know one? You can turn on audio if you know any of them. Okay, let's go ahead and go through them. All right, so I always feel like this is kind of depressing, so I apologize. It's like so early. So 1, life is suffering. 2, our suffering is based on our ignorance. Ignorance can be overcome and extinguished. We probably all know that, right? If we study and we dedicate ourselves, we'll be okay, right? And the way that we can overcome our ignorance is through the Eightfold Path. And so that was what, Katie was able to tell us in the chat. So basically, if we have the right view, the right resolve, the right speech, the right action, the right livelihood, the right effort, the right mindfulness, as well as the right concentration, we should be able to overcome our suffering, right? We should be able to overcome our ignorance. And so these are probably, you know, kind of like moral as well as, you know, kind of the right mindset for learning, right? So often when we see depictions of him, we will see him seated in the lotus position. And so that's often there to kind of symbolize his meditation. And he's often holding his hands in different mudras. Sometimes he's shown sitting on a wheel, which is that dharma as well, that wheel of law, right? So here are some other examples of his life. So his first sermon, and then his parinirvana is when he physically dies, right? And so in this image, he's kind of shown just, you know, I would say sleeping, but he's dead in the forest. A lot of other images show him kind of almost like he's a prince again, where he's bejeweled because he's reached and he's overcome that ignorance. And so we actually see, we'll have one of those images today where he is shown in the state of parinirvana, but he's shown very princely again, and he's got jewels and beautiful costumes and so on, so forth. All right, so we're going to see some different variations. We'll go over some basic styles of Buddha again on Thursday, but telltale signs, right, are that he's typically seated in the lotus position with the balls of his feet up, right? So if you do yoga, you know that's not easy to do, right? He normally has elongated earlobes, right? And remember that that's because he was a prince, and so his jewelry stretched out his ears. Often he also has a halo. So see how he has a halo around him, or a nimbus. Often he has little bodhisattvas hanging out along the halo or sitting next to him. We'll also see some images just of bodhisattvas. Bodhisattvas are basically people who decide that they're not going to ever reach their own nirvana because their place in the world is to help others obtain theirs. So they guide people to obtaining their nirvana. And the best way that I can explain this is something my husband explained to me, is that he said teachers are kind of like bodhisattvas, right? Teachers might be really good at math, but instead of becoming a mathematician who works for NASA, they teach you so that you then can go and teach math or do mathematics at NASA, right? So they don't, their job is to get you to a higher place, right? So often we see images of bodhisattvas, and when we see other images of bodhisattvas later, you'll see that they're not normally as like poor looking. They're often dressed a little bit fancier. Sometimes they've got jewels and pretty costumes and things like that. Okay, the hands are typically in mudras. So there's all these different hand positions that all convey different elements of the characteristics of Buddha. Often he has a top knot. So instead of having his hair free-flowing like Shiva, right? Remember Shiva was in mudras as well, but he had that long yogi hair. Here, Buddha has his wrapped up in a bun at the top. And then sometimes when they're seated, they are on top of what we call pradelas. And so pradelas are these horizontal kind of altar areas at the bottom. Pradelas are on church altars as well. And there we often have images that depict the stories or the teachings of Buddha, as well as images of donors, right? So here's some different images of Buddha. So here, Buddha in meditation. Here's a bodhisattva. He's in our textbook, but you can see this bodhisattva is much more like ornate in nature, right? So some basic architecture. Stupas. Stupas are burial mounds. They're not buildings. They're burial mounds that typically have the remaining remnants or relics of Buddha or important teachers of Buddhism, right? So these buildings, they look like mounds. Underneath the mound, they'll take, and of course it's not the whole body of Buddha. It would be a little element of Buddha in these different locations or these other important teachers. And so we have one large stupa, which is the Stupa of Sanchi. We're not going to do this one until we get to Romanesque architecture, because we're going to do a comparison. So right before break, we'll do this one. So this one will not be included in the quiz, but we do have some other stupas. We have one other stupa, we have two. We have some at Angkor Wat, which you saw yesterday, and then we'll have some at Borobudur as well, right? But there's all their components like archways, right? And you can see that these archways look different based on where you live on the globe. So an archway in India looks like this, right? This is a Torana, or a Tore, which is in Japanese. Those are these monumental gateways, right? So they both serve the same purpose, but you can see the style differences based on location. And then of course we have pagodas, which are typical in Japan, as well as Korea and China. And they're places that either hold relics or hold sacred writings. Here's the largest in the world, actually I haven't looked lately. It might be updated lately. This is back from 2007, so I should research and see if there's any bigger ones. This one's in China, right? So that's just a little bit of background on Buddhism. So we're gonna go all the way down, right, south in Indonesia, and we're going to be looking at the Borobudur Temple, right? The Borobudur Temple. So you have, I think, 3 images of the Borobudur Temple to look at. So it's located on the island of Java in Indonesia, and the rulers, we believe, was the Samdriya dynasty from around 800 CE. We don't really know, honestly, a lot about it. This is still kind of speculation. So we think Candi Borobudur design was conceived by the poet, thinker, and architect Gautam Harma, but you notice that he's not in the description. So this is some of the kind of like the design we think was determined by this great mind, right? And the temple, or the name Candi, right, in Javanese is pronounced Chandi. It really was like no longer used. And And that's one of the reasons why it was very mysterious. So it was used for only like 100 years. And then basically the natural environment, this kind of, you know, it was basically like a rainforesty island, kind of covered up the temple. And it wasn't till 1841 when a British lieutenant supposedly rediscovered it. I gather probably locals knew it was there, right? And so, of course, the function of it is probably pretty straightforward. It's obviously a temple, and it's also basically a monument to show the devotion to Buddha. So here's a really great view of it from the ground. So you can see that unlike some of the other temples or religious structures we've seen, this one's not very tall. It's very wide, right? And then the elevation isn't as mountain design like that we've seen before. So what do you think the design is based on? Knowing that Buddhism comes from Hinduism, who can help me out? What do you think this design is based on? You can write it in the chat. You could turn on your audio for me so I don't just have to hear my own voice. What do you think? Any educated guesses here? Oh, very good. Thank you, Jasmine. It's a mandala, right? So it's based on mandala. And so remember that the mandala is a map or a design for the universe. So it represents the whole universe. And this one is orientated to the cardinal directions. So it's north, south, east, and west. So it aligns to the heavens, right, as well. So it's basically built in 3 tiers. And it says it has a pyramidal base. Basically, it has kind of like the plinth, so it kind of comes up on a podium. And then it has the 3 levels that angle in. So that's kind of the pyramid-like structure of it. And it has 5 concentric stone terraces. And then it has stupas at the very top. So if you look here, you'll see that there are stupas, right? So these little bell shapes are stupas. So those are things that have the remnants of Buddha or other great spiritual leaders. And then there's also images of Buddha at the very top, right? Now, the surface, you can't really see it from here, but there are 72 stupas at the top, but there is a series of low reliefs. So there's all these carvings on the walls, right? So how would you experience all of those carvings or go and be able to see those Buddha images at the very top or the stupa? How would you experience that? Any ideas? Maybe remembering that once again, Buddhist philosophies come from Hinduism. What do you do at a temple? What do you think? You circumambulate. Thank you, Alana. Right? So you walk around the structure and you pray and you meditate. So you would go around and around, and you could go around at the base. Then you could climb up some of those terraces and do it again. And then climb up some more terraces and do it again, and climb up more, because you've got like 5 different, those different levels that you're going up, right? So you would circumambulate up those different levels into kind of these different series. And then at the very top, there's one large stupa. So there's a gigantic bell stupa shape at the very top. And then there's a series of smaller ones at the bottom, or at the base of that smaller one, or large one. Oh my goodness, having a hard time. So you see the large one, and then you see those 3 concentric circles full of stupas and images of Buddha, right? So the illustrations, we have one illustration that we are given, but basically the reliefs in general, the very bottom is based on the human behaviors of desire, and it has images that are like not so pleasant. Things like robbing, killing, rape, torture, defamation, just those negatives of our earthly world. The second zone, which is, kind of a large series, is kind of the transitional sphere. And so this is where humans are being released from their worldly matters, right? So they're being able to see that they can overcome all that evilness at the very bottom. And then the top zone, right, with the stupas and the Buddhas, is the highest sphere, and that's the abode for the gods. Which makes sense, right? So of those relief carvings, there is basically 460 of them. There's a lot of them. And a lot of them, like I said, have those negative sort of images to it. But the ones that are probably the most common between many different kinds of Buddhist temples is that we have illustrations of the life and teaching of Buddha, right? It makes sense. In order to learn the religion or to reinforce the basic concepts of religion, artworks and architecture often are narrative, right? They teach us about these basic truths. So we have Buddha's teachings being taught. We have the life of Buddha being taught. We have his past lives. So there's a series of things like the Jataka tells, as well as some of the other ones that are these stories of what Buddha's life was like before he was Buddha. Because of course, we're stuck in samsara. So like, sometimes he's a monkey, and sometimes he's a lion, and sometimes he's an elephant, and sometimes he's another human. And so we'll learn some of these stories when we look at this stupa at Sanchi. And then the one that we have, right? So this is the image we have, and it's really a bad image. They gave you this little one here that's really unclear, and I gave you here a better close-up. But this one is basically Queen Maya, so his mother, riding a horse carriage when she's retreating from Lumbini to give birth to the prince, right? So this journey, right, or her traveling is supposed to be symbolic of the illustration of paths, because that's what people are doing, right? They're on a pilgrimage. They're taking a path. They're taking a journey to try to reach enlightenment. So even the imagery is emphasizing this idea of travel and path, right? And birth. So it teaches us the life of Buddha, but it also teaches us some of that eightfold. Right? So here is our close-up of our Buddha and our stupas at the very, very pinnacle, very, very top. And so here you can see that they're at the top. So I circled it for you. And there we have, oh my goodness, 504 Buddhas. And all of them are kind of in slightly different poses. So there are 17 variations of mudras, so hand positions that all convey different things. So I don't think you need to know, all of those mudras, but I think it's important to know that there's a variation of mudras and that there are a lot of Buddhas and there are a lot of stupas. It looks like there's 1,500 stupas at the top. So there must be small ones around this long edge here too. Okay, questions on Borobudur? Okay, so we're going to go to Tibet, and we're going to be looking at Jowo Rinpoche. I apologize for mispronouncing that. He actually goes by another name as well. He is a part of the Jokham Temple, which is one of Tibet's earliest Buddhist temples. And it was supposedly created by the very first king of unified Tibet, and supposedly the statue was thought to have been blessed by Buddha himself. So it's supposed to be a very holy object. Rinpoche means the precious one in Tibetan, so in the Tibetan language. It actually was believed to have been made in India and then basically given to the king of Tibet in a dowry from his Chinese wife. So made in India, and then this Chinese queen, not queen, but like princess obtains it. And then it becomes part of her dowry when she marries the king of Tibet. And then mysteriously, during the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, this sculpture disappeared. And of course, Tibet is one of those territories that is kind of in, you know, in Chinese power, but also kind of always trying to be on its own. And it was actually rediscovered in 1983 in a trash heap. So they actually found it again. And so the one that we have right now had to be restored. So we're not quite sure if it's exactly right? So just keep that in mind as well. Okay, so I'm hoping that this doesn't kick out my video. If not, I'll edit it later. But I'm gonna go ahead and show you a little bit about what it's like to visit some of these sacred Buddhist temples, okay? So one of the things I want us to look at is focusing on what these people in the courtyard are doing. Can you guys see in this image here at the Jokham Temple? People are in the courtyard. So I want to focus on what they're doing, and then of course how you would interact with the Buddhist image itself. We won't watch this whole thing. So what are the people doing? That's just not sitting quietly in like meditation. So notice how the people are walking in groups. It looks like it's like an everyday sort of market or street scene, but it's not. People are walking together in pilgrimage routes. And then they're stopping to prostrate. So basically they go up and down into a more humble position. And it's very active. So they do this at different locations along these pilgrimage routes. And in the city that Jokham Temple's in, there's actually 4 separate pilgrimage routes for different temples and different ceremonies. So you can see it's loud, right? It's not quiet. There's a lot of activity. But you're trying to focus, right? You're trying to meditate when you're doing this as well. So you have to let go of that other loud sort of world. You have to kind of really focus in on your devotion. I had another video as well. We're getting to the temple here. Okay, I'm gonna backtrack here for a second because I did it too. So you can see the gold kind of denoting how important the temple is. Okay, so this right here is the wheel of Dharma, right? Sorry, I didn't realize it was going to pause right there. So that's the wheel of Dharma. So that's like the law. And then notice how there's deer on either side. The deer is really common in Buddhist decoration because it symbolizes the forest. The forest where Buddha went to meditate had a lot of deer. And I don't know if anyone's ever been to like Nara in Japan, but in the Buddhist sanctuary that we're going to see there are thousands of deer. One of my former students a few years ago went there on summer vacation after she took AP Art History, and she's like, you can't get away from the deer. They're literally like, they cover the whole temple complex. They're like wanting you to feed them and things like that. But that's all very much symbolic of that forest. Okay, so we'll go ahead and look at this. This temple too, in a way, I'm going to say is kind of mysterious. We don't really know a lot about it as well. And part of it is because of the territory differences between Tibet and China, and you know, how things have altered and changed throughout the centuries because of things like the Cultural Revolution. But let's focus on what we do know, right? So let's look at the image of Jowo Rinpoche, right? How would you characterize how we know he's important? What are the telltale signs that tell us he is important? You can turn on your audio and give me a couple. That'd be great. I've got a couple of comparisons here, some earlier images that we saw on the right. So what's he wearing?
He has a big hat, or like a big headdress.
Right. So he has this beautiful, I wouldn't even call it a crown. I think what you said, it being a headdress, is even better. He's got this gigantic headdress on, and it's covered in what? What's it covered in? What's the materials here? Ooh, we got jewels, right, in the chat. Thank you, Jeffrey and Cora. So it's covered in jewels, it's covered in gold, right? And he's sitting kind of in that meditative pose, right? So here is a depiction of that parinirvana that I was mentioning before. So this is him shown very like, he's normally dressed in monk's clothes. So here, right, see, he just has a simple monk robe on. Here, you can't really see his clothes very much because it's kind of like tight on his skin, which is typical of some of the Indian style, but it's very simple. But here, he's no longer a prince. And I know he's not the prince, like he's not the pre-Buddha, because he doesn't have earrings in. Can you see how his ears are stretched, but he doesn't wear earrings? But everything else about him is opulent. And so that is the telltale sign for me that this is his parinirvana, that he has reached and obtained nirvana, right? And his ultimate path from ignorance. So this one is also known as the Jowo Shakyamuni, right? But we have it titled as the Jowo Rinpoche. So I want to make sure that if you look it up, you might see that it has a different name. And it's gilded in metal, and he has really bright blue hair. And like I said before, we're not exactly sure if this is exactly what it looked like before the Cultural Revolution, or even when it was initially made, because of course, people add and change things at these sacred temples for hundreds of years. So we think, right, that he probably looks something like this. There are some texts from the 7th century that tells us that he had his hands in the enlightenment, like mudra. So mudra, this would prove that he had reached enlightenment. And so in this one, he's seated in the lotus position, and then his mudras here are his left hand is in meditation, which makes sense for a temple, and his right hand is calling the earth to witness, right? So it's basically calling for your attention, wants you to notice. But we do think that maybe that mudra in the past was maybe about enlightenment. So both of these works that we talked about today have some sort of level of circumambulation, right? Where people would walk around the temple, or they might take a pilgrimage or a journey, right? And there's a sense of constant meditation in the structure, outside the structure, and then once you get near the image of Buddha. Okay. So we're going to be looking at some very old Chinese art today. Okay, and we're going to be focusing on death and the afterlife. So this is not Buddhist, right? I want to make sure that I get that. We will see some Buddhist inspired Chinese art as well. Okay, so excuse me, I should have paused that here. Okay, so we're going to be focusing on kind of the convolution of these major rivers, right? And so we're going to be looking at the Qin dynasty. Does anyone know what was taking place in China during this dynasty? This is a really ancient old one. Does anyone know in general? Of course, obviously I've got our Terracotta Warriors here, but does anyone know what was taking place in China during this time in history? Okay, this is the time. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, I apologize.
Oh, the Great Wall was being built.
Yep. And this was a time where they were protecting themselves from invaders, but they were also trying to unify themselves as well. So this is the time of the unification of China underneath kind of like a large central power. And it was during the time of the very first emperor of China. Right? So we have our Terracotta Warriors, right? And so what are all these warriors doing in the tomb for the first place? Does anyone know? What are they doing there? Why would you need all of these warriors in your tomb? Any educated guesses? Oop, I don't have a slide there. Oh, to protect the emperor in the afterlife. Very good. And then just think about the number. It really proves how powerful this very first emperor was, right? It also, it doesn't just express his importance in the afterlife, but it shows his importance in the actual world as well. And so it's very similar to like the ancient Egyptians, right? Where they take things from their life and they bring all of those things with them into the afterlife. So when we look at our Terracotta Warriors, one thing that you want to notice is that they are all different. They have slight variations to them. They might have, they wear different like regalia, so it kind of denotes their rank. So their armor and their costuming and their clothing all is different based on their rank, but also importantly, their faces are slightly different. So thinking about what China was like before unification, right? It's all these people, right, from different territories in this vast area, right? They all speak different dialects. They all speak, different languages, right? They all, live in different kinds of terrain, right? So why would he include people of differences? Why would he show people with differences rather than all the same? He's trying to show that he has the power to unify all, right? He can unify everyone, that he's that powerful. So the function of these, right, is depicting the armies of Qin Shi Huang, right? And they're buried with the emperor to protect him in the afterlife, but also to prove his power on earth. These were discovered in 1974 when some farmers were digging up some of their land. And I believe this is still being excavated in certain areas. The whole complex was probably like almost like a, I don't want to say a pyramid, but it had this entire structure to it. And it had gold or mercury river, actually not gold, it had mercury rivers. There's been found mercury residue where it would have had like shimmering rivers to flow water, right, mercury through the rivers. And it would have had not just, it doesn't have just warrior figures. It also has all these other people as well. You can see at the very bottom here that in some of the pits, there are court officials, right? So the ruler is going to need his court, just like in Egypt. It had acrobats and musicians and strongmen. So there's people with like bodybuilders as well. There are 8,000 of these terracotta warriors that have been found so far, right? And they're still finding more all the time. And there's, you know, not only people, but there's horses and chariots and other things as well. Now, the construction of these, they're not solid. They're hollow and they're made out of clay. So terracotta, we've talked about before, is an earthenware. It's a clay body. And so basically what they do is they roll coils, right? So they roll coils and they would build and combine some of these features together. So the initial building would be like they would build some of them and then they would make molds of parts of them. So some of them have the same hands, some of them have the same costumes, some of them have some of the similar facial features, and then they would alter and change them, or they'd rearrange the different parts. So they wouldn't mold the whole body, they might mold the torso and then add a head to it so that they all have these different features and characteristics about them, right? And then they would individualize their faces. So they were kind of mass produced. And that's the kind of the cool thing about this part of China too, is that other things were being mass produced as well. We have coinage, we have systems of writing being unified, we have trade regulations being unified. We've all these things that are starting to be unified so that there's a sense of oneness in the country. And even in how they build these things, they're kind of doing some real innovative things like mass production of these thousands of terracotta warriors. So here's all those different facial figures. You can see the variations in them. Okay. So that's terracotta warriors. This is some other examples. The Art Institute of Chicago has a great collection of burial ceramic pieces. And this is very similar to a set that they have there, which are all based on the Silk Road. And so these are things that were buried that kind of illustrate you know, other things that you would take with you. So there's a whole caravan of these camels and these traders moving merchandise along the Silk Road. Right? The last piece we have for today on Chinese art is this banner of Lady Di, right? So this funeral banner of Lady Di. And so I used to have an activity for this, but I think to kind of give you a little bit of a break, we'll just go through it instead. But how would a banner like this be used? Any ideas how this would be used? By looking at it, is there any visual evidence that give you some sort of idea how it would be used? We're being those visual investigators here. Notice at the very top, there's kind of like these little ties. Couldn't you see this being hung on a pole in some sort of funerary procession, right? So it could be a part of the actual funeral. And then after that procession is done, this was actually covered on top of her coffin. And these were name banners to identify the dead during mourning ceremonies. So very specifically, these were not just banners for the procession, but they were to identify the dead. So this tells us, there's several parts of this image that tell us that this is for Lady Di. Right? So this is for the wife of the Marquis of Dai. It was discovered in 1972. And so there they found her body and her tomb. And it had probably some of the best preserved objects as well as human remains discovered in China. And this is a silk banner, right? So it was made out of a precious material as well. So it tells us a lot about some of these ancient Chinese funeral ceremonies and practices that were sort of a mystery. So we started learning about them in 72 once it was discovered, right? Oh, hit the wrong thing. So, oh, no, it's back to this, sorry. So this was covered over her coffin. And so like the Egyptians, there were a series of coffins. So the outer coffin was made out of wood, and it contained 4 smaller coffins with really elaborate carving and decoration on the outside. And then the banner was found laying on top of these coffins, right? So in the study guide, I have some links for you guys or some questions for you. You may have done it, but maybe you didn't do it as well. And Smart History has some basic information on this, but this art and archaeology has some other very specific information. And so I hyperlinked it here for you. It's also listed with all the Canvas ones. And this breaks apart all of the visual elements, as well as some important vocabulary in understanding this banner. So if you ever need some more information, you can always get those links from Canvas or from this presentation. But that art and archaeology is a little bit different. So, oh, my animation is gone. So how is the image broken up, right? It's actually broken up in 2 different ways. It's broken up horizontally as well as vertically. Okay, so this is an illustration from Smart History. So if we were going to look at it vertically, so we look at the left side, the center, and the right. The left side represents the yin, and the center represents a mixture of the yin and the yang, and then the right is the yang, right? So we have a division going vertically across, kind of like in columns, right? So that's part of that, kind of that T shape, okay? And then horizontally, also following that T shape, we basically have at the very top, and this is the part that's illustrated in Smart History, this very top of the T is the heavenly realm. Makes sense that the top would be the heavens, okay? Then in the middle section, we have the earth. So this is where we have Lady Di and her attendants. We have her mourners. And then at the very bottom, there's this great serpent and imagery, and that represents the underworld. I'll show you close-ups of those sections. Okay, so this is kind of the breaking up of this. So if you wanted to, in content, you could talk about what these different sections are. You could also maybe draw some little arrows and diagrams for yourself on the image in your note takers. So overall, the banner is describing her journey to heaven, right? And so it has imagery that tells us about the burial practices, but it also tells us about spirits and legends that are associated with the Queen Mother of the West. Okay, so here's some imagery that's at the top. We'll kind of break it apart. On the very top, there's a crescent moon with a toad, right? So that's on the left. And then on the right, we have a crow within a pink sun. And this is supposed to be emblematic of the supernatural world above the humans, right? So this idea of the heavens, right? Sun and the moon, that makes sense, okay? And then there is dragon. So there's a serpent here with a person, and then there's these serpents here as well. And you can see some galloping horses and other things kind of flying in the sky as well. And these two men at the very bottom here are basically guarding heaven's gates. So we have gates for heaven here, and then these two men who are protecting the heavens. So if you go to the art and archaeology, it has the symbolic meaning of the toad and the crow. Okay, so then in the center, right, here we have a close-up of Lady Di and her attendants. So here you can see her kind of as like an older woman. She's leaning on her staff, and she's got beautiful clothing on. So this is basically what her life was like at the end of her life. You know, she had her attendants with her. She's basically holding audience for these two people who are kind of crouched down, bow down to her. And so this is actually one of the first known, or one of the earliest examples of Chinese portraiture that we actually have. So then underneath her, we have these serpents, and then we have a bai, right? So we talked about bais before when we looked at kongs. Does anyone remember what those symbolize? What do bais symbolize? Right? The bai is a hole that represents the sky, right? And it's normally connected with kind of like the heavens. It's something that's real common. So jade bais are often laid around the body, right, in burials. And so the serpents intertwine that bai. Right, so remember, bais and kongs. So those are used in burial practice. Right? And then at the very bottom, we have the mourning. So this is telling us about the funerary practices of them. So when we look here, we see people underneath a tent, and then there's a series of these objects around. And so people are sitting in mourning for Lady Di. And those objects at the top are thought to probably be bells. And so bronze bells are very common. They were used in different sizes, and they were used as part of the funerary practices as well. And then at the very, very bottom, underneath that mourning hall, we have a giant black fish, a red snake, a pair of blue goats, and an unidentified earthly deity. And the deity holds up the floor of the mourning hall. So you can see it's like a little strong man there, like holding it up. Okay. It's basically holding it up, kind of protecting from these animals that represent the underworld. Okay.